I heard 30 minutes. Actually, the slides I have are for a little bit longer, but I can make it quick if it needs to be. Should I make it quicker?
That would be better, just so we can discuss.
Okay, so I will try to keep it as short as possible. So now it's okay, half an hour. We'll see what we can do. So this is a paper that appeared 2 days ago, literally, in a very nice special issue of Mind and Society, dedicated to the embodied and enactive approaches to social and moral issues. All the papers in there are absolutely great. So we were very happy to be part of it. This paper was, I've been working on this with Thomas van Es, who we both live in Belgium. He lives in Antwerp, I live in Brussels, but we met in Spain at the University of the Basque Country, where there's a big center for theoretical biology, Varelian approaches to cognition and similar stuff. So the central idea of the paper is that while labor is a central element of human life, it's fundamentally ignored in cognitive science. And the Marxian or Marxist tradition offers a very rich account of labor as a key human activity. And the idea of the paper, behind the paper, was to try to open a dialogue between these two traditions and try to see how the enactive approach can provide some tools to operationalize those ideas. So I mean, I said there's not it's not very addressed in cognitive science. There's some work that has been addressing the concept of labor, mostly in anthropology. This is a book from the early 90s by Jean Leive and Etienne Wenger. It's about essentially distributed cognition, and works on is a series of ethnographical case studies based on communities of practice, so how people learn. Learning is not just the transmission of knowledge from one mind to the other, but it's a fundamentally collective operation. And the key concept here is the notion of legitimate peripheral participation, where newcomers begin by simple tasks around the outskirt of the community of practice and gradually take more complex roles. And one key example they make is that everybody knows is AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, where the newcomer first speak a little bit and are then socialized into the correct way, the correct normativity of how the practice is to be done, essentially. Another example is this very iconic book from also the mid-90s. It's also a mostly anthropology book with a very iconic title, Cognition in the Wild, which became quite important in people that are working within broadly enactive approaches. And here it's also a very big, I think, ethnographical case studies, and the case study based on a navigation on a US Navy ship. And the general idea is that anticipating some of the ideas of the so-called extended mind theory is that both the artifacts on the ship and the various individuals, the tools, the map, and the various individuals that are involved create a form of distributed and networked form of cognition. So essentially the idea is that cognition, when it's in the wild, so not in the lab, works as this very distributed and networked system. So essentially the key arguments of the paper are that, as I was mentioning at the beginning, cognitive science still lacks a robust account of labor. The Marxist tradition centers labor, but integrating some of this insight into cognitive science remains a challenge, and that, as I was mentioning, the enactive approach offers a compelling framework to try operationalize those insights. The core claim that we are trying to develop is that labor, what is not alienated, I'll have a couple of words about this at the end, reveals the deeply social and distributed character of human cognition. And so essentially the key distinction is labor in the wild is a form of distributed autonomy based on participatory self-organization and hierarchical form of hierarchical control, as opposed to centralized control and imposed norms that are typical of the form of labor that is practiced under capitalist rule. So essentially, I will try to, as I don't have a lot of time, I will just try to give you a very broad strokes overview of the ideas that we came across in our exploration of the Marxist tradition conception of labor. One of the most iconic one is the idea of social metabolism, which is already found in Capital, where Marx talks about labor as the universal condition for the metabolism, the Stoffwechsel between man and nature. It's reiterated in History and Class Consciousness by Lukács. Labor is understood as the mediator of the metabolic interaction between society and nature. And the basic idea here is that societies, like organisms, metabolize nature, extracting, transforming, and integrating it into tools, infrastructure, and institutions. So labor essentially is what marks the shift from merely biological and properly social autonomy. So the real point of departure for us was this very short piece that was essentially sketched by Engels, entitled "The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man." It's very short, it's very sketchy, but there's some interesting ideas there. And the key idea can be essentially synthesized in the idea of a labor theory of culture. So essentially, labor is what creates human culture, is the basic catalyst of the transition from nature to society. Labor, according to Engels in this little sketch, is the prime basic condition for all human existence, and this is to such an extent that, in a sense, we have to say that labor created man himself. So essentially, I will skip on we were taking a look at Marxist physical anthropology, but essentially I will skip on that. And essentially, one of the key ideas in this essay is that essentially the use of tools creates the necessity for language. Man, this is a very iconic quote that we liked a lot when we encounter it. Man in the making, while working on tools, men in the making arrived at the point where they had something to tell to each other. So essentially, there is the key idea here that we find here. It's not very well developed, but essentially that there's a very strict relationship between tool making and language. They're essentially two faces of the same coin. Insofar as language emerges essentially from labor. Once we engage in tool use, we have, according to Engels, something to talk about. And another important element that we found in this book from the early 80s, which tries to essentially put to the test this idea against modern theories of the emergence of language, is this idea that both to making a language introduce a form of ecological displacement, in a sense that whereas pure merely natural cognition is more situated in the here and now, the capacity for creating tool is a tool can be created now to be used somewhere else at another time or by another person. So essentially, the creation of tools expands the spatio-temporal scope of human activity. This essentially, I'm going very fast here because we don't have a lot of time, but just to give you a very general idea, some of you might have read the draft of the paper, so you might know what I'm talking about. But so essentially, what is essentially quite not very well articulated in the paper by Engels is much more thoroughly articulated in the work of Vygotsky, of which Kirill is one of the key experts. So essentially, I am a little bit ashamed of talking of Vygotsky in front of Kirill, but here we go. Essentially, was Kirill who gave me a lot of literature to read, and the paper that struck me as the most important is this paper by Vygotsky and Andrea on tool and symbol in child development. And essentially the idea here is that human cognition is fundamentally social, and that it's social interaction that shapes cognition. In the sense that speech is very much as a physical tool, is something that enables a form of self-regulation and internalized social norm, in the sense that a tool, when I encounter a tool, I encounter also a series of norms of how the tool is to be used, and those norms were sedimented in the community of practice. And when I am into the community of practice, I can then change the rules of the game, in a sense. And this is kind of the same for language. And so according to Vygotsky, higher cognition emerges as a form of sensory motor activity that is transformed through interaction. Through the social interaction, I internalize cues from the community of practice, and then I make them mine, in a sense. So, and here is the little Ilyenko bit of our paper, which essentially doesn't play a very big role in the paper. It plays fundamentally like a concluding role in insofar as the concept of the ideal, as sketched by Ilyenko, is very useful in synthesizing some of those ideas. So essentially, what struck us the most was this idea that the ideal, or which in a sense can translate what Hegel defined with the notion of spirit, but differently from Hegel, here there is a much stronger emphasis on how this is generated by material engagement with the environment. So I'm going to read just a couple of quotes, one from Dialectical Logic and one from this very nice paper that Kirill wrote with Ezequiel Di Paolo. So the quote from Ilyenko is that thought revealed its force and real power not solely in talking, but also in the whole grandiose process of creating culture and the whole objective body of civilization, the whole inorganic body of man. This is a quote from the 44 manuscripts, including in that tools and statues, workshops and temples, factories and chancelleries, political organization, and systems of legislations. So, and essentially the more contemporary and naturalist-friendly translation by Ezequiel and Kirill is that the ideal exists essentially in tools, artifacts, and social institutions as they orient and enable our social practices. So again, I'm going to conclude this very, very quick survey on the Marxist idea of labor. And while we were concluding the first articulation of this section, we came across through completely randomly through an article I found online on Jacobin that were advertising the Spanish translation of this work by Lukács, which was his last work, and it's a 3-tome ontology of the social being, one on Hegel, one on Marx, and one on labor. And again, here in the third volume, we find even more articulated those ideas that are already found in History and Class Consciousness, according to which labor is essentially the catalyst of the dialectical transition from nature to society, and it essentially is the catalyst that is able to transform biological life into socially organized structure. So from tools to institutions. So what Hegel essentially called objective spirit. And this occurs essentially by adhering to norms that we find in our community of practice that are sedimented in the tools, that are sedimented in the institutions, that are sedimented in the way language is used within the community of practice. And so essentially we move from legitimate peripheral participation into mastery, and then we can change the rule of the game of how how the norms are set within the community of practice. So essentially, to put it in a slogan, the ontology of the social being is, according to Lukács, an ontology of labor. So this was very quick. I think I was able to do it in more or less 15 minutes. Now I have other 15 minutes to try to make you understand how the kind of weird connection that we try to make between all these Marxist ideas and cognitive science. And the kind of cognitive science that we were engaging in is what some people call the enactive approach. And it's an approach that comes from the pioneering work of Francisco Varela, which can be divided essentially in a paper I wrote with another colleague on Hegel and the enactive approach a couple of years ago. We divide it into two main strains. One that is more biologically based, that essentially focused on the concept of biological organization, which draws from the key work from the 79 principle of biological autonomy, which just got republished by MIT Press this month, last month in May, were essentially rearticulated in the most famous autopoiesis in cognition from the 1980, and then more recently rearticulated by Alvaro Moreno and Matteo Mosso in Principles of Biological Autonomy, which appeared in 2015. And the truly enactive approach, though, was born in 1991 with this key work, The Embodied Mind, in which Francisco Varela, Ivan Thompson and Eleanor Roche tried to mediate essentially the third person work done in cognitive science with the first person phenomenological approach, phenomenological approach, and further articulated by Ivan Thompson in 2007 in this very nice book, Mind in Life, and more recently by Ezequiel Di Paolo and co-authors in this other book called Sensorimotor Life. So there's another book on which we draw even more, which is Linguistic Bodies, which appeared also by Ezequiel Di Paolo and other co-authors in 2018 for MIT Press. So essentially, the connection that we try to do, mostly relying on linguistic bodies and on another more recent articulation, which I'm going to talk about in a second, so we based our attempt at connection on two key concepts. One is participatory sense making, which essentially is probably the most famous enactive concept, is the concept that is used to define social cognition. And the key idea is that meaning emerges in social cognition through coordinated and embodied interactions. So social cognition is not theory of mind. It's not I have my own cognition, you have your own cognition, and then I try to understand what you have within your head, but it's more a cooperative enterprise, essentially. And another concept that we based our theoretical attempt on was the concept of ecological norm development, and essentially is this idea that I've been touching upon already with all this idea on community of practice. It's the idea that essentially is a form of is a way of rearticulating the concept of niche construction. Essentially, is the idea that organisms create and modify ecological norms that, but at the same time, an organism finds an ecological set of norms, and at the same time contributes to then shape them. So essentially, a couple of words on each of the two concepts. Participatory sense making was articulated first in 2007 in the most cited enactive paper to date by Hanne de Jager and Ezequiel Di Paolo in 2007, participatory sense making, an active approach to social cognition. The key example of participatory sense making that is always brought about when we try to explain the concept is the so-called hallway dance, in which when I encounter someone on a hallway and I try to go right and the other person does the same, and then so for a while we're unable to go past each other until we break up the coupling and we are able to go each on his own way. And this is a very basic and non-structured form of participatory sense making, but way more articulated versions are possible, and some of these are articulated in Linguistic Bodies, the 2018 book, and mostly essentially a conversation. The way we learn language essentially is a form of participatory sense making, in a sense that I hear a certain sentence, a certain expression, and then I keep it as something that is in a way legitimate within the community of speaker, or I can challenge it once I'm into the community of speakers. But in this case, in the case of language, that it's not something that once we go past each other, it's over. It's something that gets sedimented and leaves a form of objective trace. And this is exactly the addition that is, in my opinion, well articulated in this more recent book. It appeared, I think, in 2023 by Miguel Sepulveda Pedro. And the key idea of this book is the idea of that. So essentially, one of the key concepts of the enactive approach is sense making. And what Miguel tries to do here is to cash out the concept in terms of, so essentially he says, what is sense making? Sense making is the development of ecological norms. And essentially the idea here is that, that the idea that can be drawn from this book is that ecology is where normativity gains a foothold, which is what I was talking about 5 seconds ago. So in essentially that our adaptive interaction with the environment continually, so we find a normatively laden environment, and at the same time we are shaped by the norms that are within the environment and the community of practice, and we then contribute to shape them in turn. So essentially there's a form of ecological feedback loop where organisms on the one hand adapt to their environment, but at the same time their action, again, this is a form of niche construction, alter the environment. So essentially these changes transform the norm that shape future interactions. And one example or a key concept that we use to make sense of this, since my co-author is Dutch, there is this very nice concept of olifantenpadjes. I don't know, I still keep pronouncing it wrong to date, but essentially it's the idea of elephant path is the trail on the grass that if I walk on a piece of grass and then someone else is essentially implicitly invited to follow, and the repeated walking creates the way across the pathway across the grass. So essentially an intentional repeated behavior that creates norms in the space. This is a way how behavioral norms are sedimented in the environment. So with these two concepts, what we tried to do in the last section of the paper was to essentially provide the connection that we were promising in the introduction, which is essentially, on the one, how do these concepts help us conceive of the notion of labor as it is articulated from by the Marxist tradition. So on one hand, labor, we try to provide cashing out the notion of labor as a form of participatory sense making, in the sense that norms are learned through training, connection, and participation, are a participatory dynamic, and in which then issues of forms of cognition. So a tool is used in a certain way. So the repeated use essentially build up a form of normativity which is sedimented in the tool. And this is how, so this is why the two concepts are fundamentally connected. Labor is also a form of ecological norm development, because once it is created, the norm is essentially sedimented within the tool, then it stabilizes within the environment. So essentially, once another agent enters the ecology of the community of practice, finds that norm already there. So essentially, this is we're trying to put everything together, and I hope it was not too fast, but I tried to stay within the time that was available, and then we can of course articulate that further in the discussion. So essentially, there is this very famous way of saying from the very beginning of the enactive approach that organisms bring forth a world through their cognition. And more recent, there was a very recent paper from a couple of years ago by two Brazilian colleagues in which they were saying, I think the title is bringing forth the world literally, in the sense that it's not only a cognitive process in which an organism brings forth the world through their capacity by opening an Umwelt, but it's also true in much more objective ways in the form of niche construction, which, by the way, is playing a very important role in recent debates on evolutionary biology. So essentially, this is an idea that we take from Sepulveda Pedro, is that enactive cognition is always in place, in the sense that cognition arises from networks of shared practices. There's no cognition that is abstracted from the network of complex network of shared practices. And these social practices are objectively sedimented. Again, this is my Hegelian background, so I maybe tend to over-rely on Hegelian terminology, but it's essentially what Hegel called objective spirit, is the objective sedimentation of collective practices. So essentially, this is a very dialectical element in which you do have a really strong form of connection between subject and object, in the sense that where the subject is not the individual subject, the transcendental subject is the collective subject, and the way this collective subjectivity is then sedimented into institutions. So in a sense, social and material environment don't simply extend cognition as the theory of the extended mind will have it, but they actually really shape it and are in turn fundamentally shaped by it. So when we were reading stuff on the extended mind, we had always the impression that it was still too abstract in the dialectical sense, because it's still, you have the cognition and then you have the tool, and they're two different things in a way. But the thinking dialectically implies that we really make sense of how they're fundamentally entangled with one another. So essentially, drawing a few conclusions, enactivism on the one hand offers a model of cognition that is interactive, historically and ecologically situated, and essentially resistant to individualism. And these are components that should be at least very materialist friendly or Marxist friendly in a sense, whereas Marxist theory has also something important to offer to the enactive approach, because it essentially embedding a form of political critique into a theory of cognition. I think there's a guy in Berlin called Jan Slaby, and I read a few papers by him. He's also into the same special issue we published in, and he's really, really interesting. And he has this idea of a political philosophy of mind, which is, I think, goes more or less into this direction. Essentially, having a theory of cognition you cannot completely abstract that from political consideration. And just to conclude, I was presenting this paper a couple of weeks ago in Venice to Matteo Pasquinelli's group, and I on the email I saw that Corina reviewed his book, and so essentially we were actually invited by one of the reviewers to deepen this connection, and we were really grateful for it. So essentially, in this paper from 2019, which constitutes my favorite chapter of Pasquinelli's book on artificial intelligence, The Eye of the Master. Essentially, Matteo is very keen on this concept of the concept of the general intellect, which is formulated in the Grundrisse and then disappears or changes form in Capital, and it becomes the Gesamtarbeiter. But in his opinion, loses some of its theoretical strength. Essentially, the idea of the enactive approach is that autonomy is realized through cooperative, co-regulated activity, not by isolating the individuals. And this is an idea that, as I mentioned, we find articulated in the 44 manuscript and in the Grundrisses. in the Grundrisse, where Marx emphasizes that cognition is socially and materially embedded and is articulated by this concept of general intellect. And so essentially the political bit that we were invited to think about by one of the reviewers was that essentially under capitalism, so labor in the wild works in this network form and is a form of realization of individual autonomy, but under capitalist rule, this potential is fundamentally inverted, and labor no longer fosters autonomy, but becomes essentially a mechanism of alienation. And again, so the essential dichotomy here is between labor in the wild, which is a form of distributed cognition, distributed autonomy, and a form of centralized control that you have under capitalist rule. So I hope it was not too fast. I think I was perfectly within the half an hour. So I hope you understood enough for us to discuss.
Thanks for that, Andrea. And sorry for rushing through that. Yeah, so maybe we can recap and unpack some things to go a bit slower in terms of yeah, what you were talking about, and then yeah, we'll take questions from others. Yeah, so I wanted to first briefly bring it back to Ilyenkov and how Ilyenkov interacts with the kind of tradition that you're talking about. I mean, it's interesting. There are a few different traditions that Enactivism draws from. So actually, yeah, even before this, I thought of another thing, which is the idea of bringing forth a world. Activism in part started through Maturano, who's associated with constructivism, which is in some ways a very liberal tradition, where kind of in some ways it's really focusing on my ability to construct the world, this bringing forth a world. So you're kind of contrasting with that view. But I wanted to emphasize another tradition that Maturano and Varela are drawing on. So for Ilyenkov, the tradition of cybernetics is deeply connected to capitalism. So as we know it, capitalism and cybernetics are pretty much similar. Yeah, it's an expression of capitalist ideology. So do you think that Ilyenkov's diagnosis is mistaken, or is there some way to distinguish bad cybernetics from good cybernetics, or do you want to kind of get rid of the cybernetic core of Enactivism?
That's a very, very nice question. It's a tough question, and I don't know if I have a fixed position on this yet. But I was discussing this with Matteo Pasquinelli as well, because so my two favorite chapters in The Eye of the Masters. The Eye of the Masters has two sections. One about the more ancient stuff, the more modern stuff, the 19th century, and one about the 20th century. My favorite chapter in the 19th century stuff is the one on the general intellect, and my favorite chapter in the second one is the one about cybernetics. And I've been discussing this for a very long time also with my friend and colleague Matteo Mossio, who wrote his habilitation a few years ago on the history of teleology. And he has a very, very strong, he feels very strongly about cybernetics, in the sense that it's just a theory of machine. It's just, so we need to get rid of cybernetics fundamentally. And Matteo Pasquinelli agrees completely. And I think this is the main idea of the chapter in The Eye of the Master, is essentially that we need to get rid of cybernetics. Cybernetics is a form of mechanization of the mind. And on this note, there is this very important book which was originally published in French in the 90s with the title Aux origines des sciences cognitives by a guy called Dupuy, and got translated into English, I think in the mid-2000s, as The Mechanization of the Mind, the origins of cognitive sciences. And he has a very nuanced view of cybernetics, in my opinion, which is not against what you were saying, is essentially very, very critical, but in a slightly different way, in a sense that he sees cybernetics as a form of as a missed chance, a series of missed encounters, a missed encounter with theoretical biology, a missed encounter with phenomenology, and essentially this is exactly what the enactive approach is all about, is taking key ideas from cybernetics, autonomy, feedback loops, and embedding them within a theory of biological autonomy, within a phenomenological theory of cognition. So essentially, and the way I will articulate the answer is through this very, very nice autobiographical paper by Varela, in which it's completely heartbreaking. It's called The Early Days of Autopoiesis, Heinz and Chile. Heinz is Heinz von Forster, the father of so-called second order cybernetics, who was absolutely instrumental in helping Varela become who he was supposed to become. And the paper is very nice because it talks about Heinz von Forster, but he also talks about the time of Varela in Chile, when just before, and when everything was super nice with Allende, and everybody was super enthusiastic, and then the coup, and then he had to flee to Paris. So in a sense, there's a connection between the older cybernetics and capitalism, but in a sense it also has the roots of its own Aufhebung, I would like to say.
Thank you. Great. Yeah, that's really interesting way to weave it through. So yeah, we've got a question from Georgios in the chat, which is, do we not have cases of enactments of contradictory norms? So you've talked about the sedimentation of norms. So you might think of this kind of stratified picture. Can we have enactments of contradictory norms?
Absolutely. This is something we didn't get into in this version of the talk. We did get into this in the version of the talk we presented in London at the conference Kirill organized in 1 year ago, was almost exactly now. And essentially, this idea of autonomy that I presented in the first slide with Varela, and so essentially we have a scaffolded, autonomy is a scaffolded landscape, one in which you have the most basic biological autonomy, which is the capacity for an organism to self-maintain. It's the norm of self-maintenance that is realized in metabolism. But then, and this is something the book by Ezequiel Di Paolo, Sensory Motor Life, talks about. Essentially, what that book is about the way in which cognition is fundamentally rooted in biological self-maintenance, but it's also, so it's fundamentally embodied and embedded, but it's also autonomous. And this they define as sensory motor autonomy, in the sense that I am a biological autonomous system, but insofar as I start relating to the environment, I generate forms of they call sensory motor loops, or which are it's the very technical and a little bit complicated term to define habits. Habits are these forms of circular relation between the organism and the environment, which form self-maintaining loops that are, but this loop is not the loop of course, without the loop of metabolism, we will not have habits, but are independent. It's so it's scaffolded on that. And essentially social autonomy, which is what the paper and the talk was mostly about, is a further layer on that. And the example of contradictory norm that we were jokingly referring to was, right now I'm giving a talk, I might have the biological urge to go to the bathroom, but I have also the social norm of finishing the talk and answering to the question and do the best I can in doing so. So essentially, since normativity and autonomy is fundamentally scaffolded at various layers, almost all the time the norms of self-maintenance, the norm of habits might be, or the social norms are contradict with one another. Another classical example is that habits, as we know, can be bad. So I have the habit of smoking, and so it has a form of normativity in a way, in the sense that I keep smoking because I have the habit of smoking, and after the coffee I need to smoke, and then I'm nervous, I need to smoke. But that's very much contradictory with the norm of self-maintenance. So this happens almost all the time.
Okay, we can come back maybe to this issue of contradiction. Lars, you have a question, and anyone else wants to raise their hand, the question would be great.
Okay. I think this is a very interesting paper, you know, and I liked it a lot, actually, and it complies very much with my own thinking, and I think it crafts interesting paths for advancing or uncovering aspects of Ilienko's thinking that we might not have addressed before. And one such path, I think, is what you mentioned on page 12 in your paper, that Ilienko's account creates a dichotomy between biological and social. And seems like once the social domain emerges, it seems operates independently, leaving biology behind. And I think this is a very important question, and of course it goes with the enactive approach that you're suggesting, and I would like to see that path developed more. And another thing that you brought forward is this bringing forth of the world. You know, I think this is a very interesting concept. You know, and Weber and Varela wrote a paper in 2002 where they talk about a sense-creating purpose whence meaning comes to its surrounding, thus making a distinction between the world of the organism and the environment. Then I also have some comments, you know, or maybe questions. One is why you didn't use Marx's concepts of praxis as a foundation for understanding labor, and in particular the first thesis of Feuerbach, from which Ilienko started his thinking, I think. And that would give you a very firm foundation of the concept of labor, I think, that you could work out from. And another thing, I'm very skeptical, you know, about statements suggesting that mental activity occurs outside the skull, you know. For example, you say that cognitive processes are embedded in evolving social practices, a social extended mind, fundamentally distributed nature of human cognition, and cognition becomes sedimented objectively in the tool. You know, I think these kind of statements are very problematic, you know, if you go to a very, very profound sense of what we're talking about. And I believe that continuing this kind of path would it's actually a dead end, you know. You have to rethink about this. And the final remark or question is on page 7, and you also refer to that statement in your presentation, that the ideal exists objectively in tools, artifacts, and social institutions. I would say that there's no way you can decide if an artifact is idealized or not, you know. It doesn't put any mark on the artifact. And you have to think about idealization in a different way, I think. You because and I have examples from my own practice that it's impossible actually to see on an artifact if it's been idealized or not. Yeah, well, I'll finish there. Thank you.
Okay, lots there to consider, and thank you, Lars, for your comments. Andrea, is there anything from Lars's reading that you'd like to come back on?
I mean, I will have to think about it and give another talk, but I will do my best. There was a very, very rich comment. I couldn't ask for anything better than this. So I have a series of bullet points. Let's see how long it takes me. So first of all, Weber and Varela, 2002 was probably the paper that that transformed me from quite boring Hegel scholar into an activist, essentially, because I was working on teleology and Kant, and between Kant and Hegel, and I read this paper, and it was essentially the criticism that they were doing through Jonas and other German authors to Kant was very much in line with mine, and this is how I ended up becoming a Varelian, essentially. So in order from what you said, so the dichotomy between biological and the social. So this is true. This is something I didn't get very much into during the talk because I chose another angle, but it did play a fundamental role in our thinking leading to this paper. And of course, the key reference there is to the essay, The Biological and the Social by Ilienko, which in the end didn't feature a very, very central piece in the last version of the paper. But it does play a role as a general background. So the way we situate ourselves with regard to the Marxist tradition, so the critical aspect that we were emphasizing, so what enactivism or the enactive approach can bring to the table for Marxist thinkers. And our response to that question was, if you read this labor theory of culture, it's something that you find essentially in Lukács as well. You find it in Ilienko. It's this idea that it's not about nature, it's about society. Essentially, the key idea there is the whole Marxist idea that fundamental differentiation come from specific forms of organizing labor and society, so you cannot naturalize it. And essentially, one of the reasons for which Ilienko was fundamentally against forms of biologization was that, in his opinion, they were reifying forms of social organization and naturalizing them. And it's something we have every time we look out of our window. It's about gender, about race, and in many cases about class. So essentially, it's the person that has a low IQ, but it's not the way society is organized, et cetera, et cetera. So in a sense, I'm completely on board with the political point, but this political point as a counterpart, which is essentially which is something that in a way should sound strange for a Marxist and a materialist, because you're cutting out the relationship between the embodied material component of cognition that are key into building society, and then of course are also impacted by society. And this is something that not only Ilienko, also another very famous Marxist thinkers, Richard Lewontin, who was also a fairly important geneticist. I think that there's a very important book called Not in Our Genes, which is, again, and I'm completely on board. And Lewontin was a key reference in the embodied mind. So essentially, criticizing genocentrism, sign me up, absolutely. But saying no to genocentrism doesn't mean that we need to create a chasm between biology and society. And I think the framework that the enactive approach and the theory of biological autonomy as a whole provides is a non-genocentric, non-reductionist way of thinking about the relation between biology and society, so nature and society. And the Marx concept of praxis, I will about that, I will throw back the ball in your court, and I will ask you to tell me more, because this is something, this is the first, I'm a very, very boring left Hegelian, and my co-author was the real Marxist of the two, and this is essentially for me a very first exploration, and I'm very happy to start exploring more. So maybe you can tell me a bit more about that. And to conclude about the concept of the ideal. So this is it's a fair issue, and I don't know if I have a fully developed answer on this, but it's a question that was posed to us by another reviewer on a converging paper, which is essentially on Hegel and the extended mind, fundamentally, which is currently under the second round of reviews. And the key idea of that paper is in a way similar or converging with this paper, is the idea that cognition is something that is done together. There is no cognition that is not social cognition, at least when it comes to major human cognition. And the reviewer was saying, yeah, but you know, cognition is something that we do in our minds. Sometimes we do it together, sometimes we do it alone. So I don't see this point of completely expanding cognition all the way. So the first step of an answer to this will be, again, this is the Hegelian in me that speaks. The term mind in German is expressed with the term Geist, but Geist is a very complex. Essentially, if you go in the German department, the Philosophie des Geistes is what you could, it's the philosophy of mind that you could study at Stanford. But for Hegel, Geist, it's of course individual cognition, but it's also the way individual cognition is fundamentally shaped by ecological norms, by, I mean, the way your cognition work is fundamentally shaped by the way your family brought you up, by the class you belong to, by the race and all the societal issues that come with being of a certain race, except for another. So essentially, I'm not saying that I don't use my brain to think, I use yours, but I'm saying that the way I use my brain is very, very much impacted by the way you use yours if you are in my community of practice. So I think that's and that the stuff on the ideal, yeah, this is kind of like the same. It's a follow-up on this. I'm not saying that the artifact is idealized, but I'm saying that the mental activity that we do together, it's sedimented in the tool, and then a more complex version of that is an institution. So we decide, it's not something we completely consciously do, it's something that happens, and then history makes its course, and then we establish an institution, and an institution is a sedimented version of a collective thinking process. So in that sense, the way we read and we like Ilienko's concept of the ideal is the fact that Geist, as this collective mind, is not something that happens, it's not like, as more like right Hegelians will read it, like this phantasmatic spirit of history. It's something very much materially embedded. It's something we do with our hands and with our language, and then that becomes institutions and tools and stuff that is out there in the world.
Thanks. We'll come to Maxim and then Karina.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrea, for your presentation. It's really important to find connections and maybe some repercussions between very distinct traditions, and to provide more critical and reflexive view of enactivism, and especially its historical roots in second-order cybernetics and its supposed subjectivist and individualist epistemology. So I have some sort of fragmentary comments or a set of questions perhaps about the another historical parallel to the discourse that you're developing, because first of all, what I think that when you talk about canonization and sedimentations of tools or values or patterns of activity, it seems to me, at least, it seems to be to have a risk of being conservative, meaning that as an enactivism, we always stress, we always emphasize the ability of the system to maintain its cognitive or practical structures. We always make accent on its viability, on its stability, on its resilience, and on its ability ultimately to preserve its existence in a more or less conserved form, let's say, right? And in this sense, it's somehow similar to what Marc Richier, a phenomenologist from Belgium, called a situation when I find myself in a movie, in the middle of a movie, when I cannot understand the roles and in which I have to accept the roles that was pre-given to me to play. So in this sense, these sedimentations and affordances are controlling me. And my concern here is that this harmonious view is somehow conservative and normative in a bad sense. And with this in mind, probably we can recall, first of all, the cybernetic roots of enactivism and its basis on epistemological individualism, which is also very problematic and liberal, because, for example, as some other Soviet philosophers I wanted to talk about in my comments, mainly the philosophers from so-called Moscow logical circle, they were very harsh against the epistemological Robinsonate, as they call it, as, for example, Mirab Mamardashvili in the late 60s, when he was criticizing different positivist epistemologies, he was developing this Marxist idea of Robinsonate as a premise of classical political economy and criticize it from the collectivist standpoint, and so on and so forth. But the main thing I wanted to talk about today is that perhaps another component of this critique of reductionist view of labor, and especially intellectual or cognitive labor, can be given not only from Ilyenkov, but also from this Moscow logical circle. Because in the 50s, on the philosophical faculty in Moscow, there was a discussion about the subject of philosophy and the scenarios for development of logic, mainly the Hegelian logic or Marxist logic as it was developed in Marx Capital. So Ilyenkov was only one side of this discussion, and his opponents were people from the Moscow logical circle who later became the Moscow methodological circle. And for them, the main essence was the labor as an intellectual activity preoccupied with scientific research, basically. And for them, what was important to conceptualize activity or cognition or labor is not the maintenance of already established structures, not the maintenance of what is already given and what is normal and what can be reproduced and so on and so forth, but rather the situations of what they called ruptures. Ruptures when the norms and when the established partners cannot work, when they are disabled, when they stop being efficient. So when you have to reassess your own position and reassess the norms and values of your activity. So in this sense, these ruptures, such as, for example, contradictions, right, or some problems with making an engineering project or whatever, or in pedagogy, for example. So these ruptures, they provoked reflexivity. So for these philosophers, like for Shchedrovitsky or Mamardashvili or Zinoviev, for all those people, ruptures were the movers of reflexivity, and reflexivity was understood as a collective reestablishment of norms, of rules, and inventing new norms, inventing new patterns or frameworks for activity. And in this sense, for them, what was much more important in labor was not simply a multiplication of the same pattern of activity, but rather revolutionary change or inventing something new and creative, and thus to always reassess your own basis of cognition. And just to add some last part is that for me, at least, as a researcher in both enactivism and Soviet philosophy, this reflexivity that was developed by these later Soviet Marxists is much deeper and much more profound than reflexivity as it was developed in enactivism. and this is some kinds of my hot take, because reflexivity as an analysis of your labor structures, let's say, or cognitive structures, as was provided in enactivism or neurophenomenology, is much more subjectivistic than this collective view of activity and reflexivity as a series of ruptures, as provided in the Moscow methodological circle in the 60s and 70s. So just to add this comment and to ask you, what do you think about this, whether it is relevant at all? Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Very, very relevant. So short answer and a longer answer. So the short answer is that you should not worry that this should go conservative, because if you, I don't know if you, something that always struck me when I was having my first meetings with Ezequiel Di Paolo was we had this library behind, and he had like a little saint of Lenin. So I think dialectics, well, it's very much embedded into the fundamental structure of at least this version of the enactive approach. The longer and more serious version of the answer, I will articulate around 2 levels, which have been kind of like the levels on which we have been played during the Q&A for a couple of minutes, which is biology and society. So I really like the question, essentially the idea that so the risk, if I understand your question correctly, is that if you focus too much on self-maintenance, then, and this is a criticism that has been leveraged against the enactive approach and the theory of biological autonomy for quite some time, but also within the same tradition, is that, yeah, all these emphasis on self-maintenance, then it's essentially, you cannot reduce everything to self-maintenance. But at least the version of the theory that I like, which is the one that comes from the version of biological autonomy in the Matteo Mossio and Alvaro Moreno version, and the enactivism in the Di Paolo version, is very much integrate all this idea of reflexivity and ruptures and contradictions and breakdowns that's very much embedded in the fundamental structure of the theory. So on this score, I'm currently working with a very brilliant PhD student on the relation between autonomy and evolution. Of course, we want to think evolution not in the way Leontine is criticizing, all this genocentrism, this historical dimension of in which the selfish gene that reproduces itself. But we are wondering whether there's another way, one that Leontine will be much more on board with, of thinking about how evolution takes place on a historical scale, which is also a very historical materialist question to ask. And one of the key papers of the theory from, I would say, 10 years ago, by Matteo Mossio and a bunch of other co-authors, essentially they were working on this in the mid-2010s about the fundamental relation between, of course, stability is key, but you cannot have stability without variation. And so the whole point is juggling the relation between stability and variation. Of course, you need a form of robustness, because if you don't have a form of robustness, you have no coalition of anything. An organism, an institution, at some point there needs to be some form of robustness for something to be called what it is. This is an organism, it's currently there and it's currently alive. Or this is an institution, it's there and it's working its role as an institution. But essentially, this form of self-organizing dynamics, there's more recent work by a Polish guy called Konrad Werner, who has been working on an enactive theory of institutions. And essentially, an institution is very much, as an organism maintains itself by the coalition of all of its parts. But so when an organism maintains itself historically, so across generations, there is going to be some variation in which that particular organization maintains itself, but it changes some parts, or some of that parts. If you believe in this form of plasticity-led evolution, it's not just random, it's just what the organism is doing is also producing some of that variation. So the organism, to use Lewontin's term, is not only the object, but it's also fundamentally the subject of its own evolution. Organisms are doing stuff that changes the way of their evolution. So essentially, the way that that variation is articulated is what allows the organism to maintain itself across generation. Because if you don't have variations, you succumb to the environment. Essentially, that's the same for institutions. Institutions work as long as they are meeting the needs of the people that make them what they are. And so essentially, in a way very much converged with this idea of community of practice. So you meet an institutional world when you become a functional adult into society. And then, so of course, you meet those norms. Those norms are there. You cannot question them. You go to school. They tell you how you write, how you read, and how you behave. And then when you are a master, you achieve mastery in the community of practice. You can say no, but the way as people are doing now about genders, about race, about sexual orientation, about this way of thinking about stuff is not right. We should change it. So once you are a master within the community of practice, you can say, no, we need to change the rules. So that's the variation part. So of course, you cannot have stability without variation always. And this, I think, in my opinion, a very, as much enactive as historical materialist way of thinking, in my opinion.
Thanks. And on to Karina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrea. It was really, really great to hear this. My main criticism is that I don't think you're Hegelian enough. And I don't think you need to apologize for being Hegelian, because I think the discussion has shown the need for developing the understanding of the ideal, and in particular the dialectics of the ideal, which came up in the early question as well. And to what extent is this contradiction? Does development take place through contradiction? And this is very relevant to what we just heard from Maxim, because of course norms and habits, there's a relationship between norms and habits, and this whole thing about the elephant makes his path and then others are encouraged to follow that path. I mean, that's great for a kind of ecological process, but if you're talking about society, and are we just going to follow in the paths that others have made? Or, is there, the whole point is, Marx obviously said the weight of the past is huge on human beings, this burden of the past that we bear, and that is objectified in norms in society. How can those norms be broken, as well as, as others have said, the norms can be very destructive and negative. And that was, I think, the point as well of the comment that Ralph put in right at the beginning. I know he had to leave, but the role of fantasy, the role of destructiveness, the role of emotion in these processes, which are very much human aspects, not just natural animal natural aspects of this ideal. And I think we're struggling still with the lack of study of the ideal itself, and we've been struggling to actually get the translation published. I mean, Sasha Freiberg's working on that, so I think we can make a big development if we work on that further. In relation to that, I've had sort of problems with this word sedimentation, because it's a kind of natural scientific term, but does it really work with human social processes? Does it kind of is it too general? Does it need to be does it need to be worked upon and maybe improved, and maybe there's some better way of trying to understand what this sedimentation is? Is it the ideal entering into the tool? Is that the sedimentation? But it's too for me. It's too non-human, if you like. I don't know if that makes sense. That was all. But thank you. It's really tremendous to have this. You know, for the way you've traced this development.
Thanks,
And,
Karina. So
yeah.
anything there?
I will ask you to maybe specify a little bit more, because it's a very interesting comment. In what sense exactly, so that I can connect it to the rest of the question? Do you think that I'm not being Hegelian enough?
Well, of course, the dialectic is immediately involved, and even in cybernetics, and the feedback mechanism that is an example of a form of dialectic, and the way in which the path is made by walking, that is a dialectic. But what I was thinking about was how do these processes transform into their very own opposites? How do leaps take place? How does negation, that from the social to the human, I mean, from the ecological to the social to the human mind, these are not, there's not just straight line development here, or evolution or emergence. There are leaps, and there's moments of emptiness and moments of nothing in between these developments in human beings and human society. And for example, if you have a self-maintaining organism, and societies are also self-maintaining to some extent, there are moments when these societies cannot function any longer, when the ecological crisis is so big that transformations, huge destructive transformations take place, as we're seeing in front of our own eyes. And these moments, defining and explaining and understanding and changing these moments, I think is what we need to think about and do.
Okay, I think it's a difficult point. I'll do my best. So norms and habits, the burden of the past, how habits are objectified in norms, the fact that norms can be destructive, and the criticism of the concept of sedimentation. And the fact that the last addition is this idea that, if I understand it correctly, there is a lack of attention for contradictions. Maybe we are not emphasizing that enough, and that might be the case. Honestly, I have to say, we were afraid of being too Marxist for the reviewers. We ended up being not Marxist enough for the reviewers in the end. So you might have a point there. But the way I think about this, the first concept that comes to mind in trying to answer this question is very much connected to Maxim's question about was fundamentally focusing on ruptures, contradiction, and the concept that, while Maxim was asking his question and while you were asking his question, that I've written down twice and circled around, is the concept of breakdowns. And breakdowns, it's almost, I will say, an operational concept that we find in linguistic bodies. By the way, I really advise everybody here to take a look at this book, because it's a book we're going to talk about for a very long time, in my opinion. And one of the concepts, the key concept there is in when they're trying to re-articulate dialectically the concept of a participatory sense making. The concept of participatory sense making was formulated in the mid-2000s and was under also some forms of criticism for being still too individualistic. So of course, it's something we do together, but it's two individuals, and it's not really dialectical enough. And 10 years later, what they're trying to do is really cash it out in a way that is much more dialectical. And they articulate a full account and a conceptual framework to do so. And one of the key concepts is the concept of breakdown, in which if we have a participatory sense-making relation currently, because we are asking a question, I'm trying to understand where you're coming from and trying to give you an answer that corresponds at the best of my abilities to what I think you are asking me about. But this could go wrong in a lot of different ways. Maybe we can crosstalk each other. Maybe the computer doesn't work, or maybe our theoretical points are just incompatible. So even in the very simple form of participatory sense making, breakdowns are essential. And then if we want to keep having a form of in this case, academic participatory sense making, we need to recover from those breakdowns. Otherwise, the feedback loop between the two autonomous systems ceases to exist. And this is true as well for, arguably, for institutions, because institutions are, and this is something Matteo Pasquinelli told me during our conversation. Essentially, the problem of normativity is the problem of habit. So norms is the way you do stuff most of the time. So when you deviate from that, you're not doing it right, in a sense. And institutions are essentially, and here I come to the sedimentation point, institutions are essentially sedimented habit. What are laws? Laws are, this is how you do stuff, and if you don't do it that way, you're deviating from the norm. But laws can be changed, essentially. I mean, we had slavery, now we don't have slavery anymore. We had discrimination, now we have a little bit less discrimination. So essentially, in an active account of institution, there is always space, which is kind of really connected to Maxine's point. It risks being conservative, but I think even if we don't, maybe it doesn't transpire enough, maybe we should do a better job at that. I think that's really this idea of contradictions and dialectics and historicity and collective against individualist epistemology is fundamentally the way we say, and this is why we try to make the connection, is really they're really trying to do the same thing. So they should really get together and do it together, essentially.
Thanks. That's great. Andrew, and then I wanted to make a remark joining some of these threads.
I think focusing on what's distinctive about Ilyenkov, I would suggest the opposite to Kuina. I would suggest you're too Hegelian. The crucial basis in Ilyenkov, certainly in his book Dialectical Logic, when it comes to thinking about fundamental dualism, you're talking about, is there a problem with the dualism of biology and sociality? But this fundamental one is a relation between mind and matter, or thought and extension. And Ilyenkov takes a Spinozist position that there's not a dualism, that they're two different aspects of the same thing, two different attributes of substance. Or another word for it is real infinite nature. So thought is an attribute of real infinite nature, an aspect. So that's his view, that's his fundamental basis in terms of his theory of thought, the ideal. He's Spinozist. It's not a dualism. But this, I could then relate it to some of the rest of the discussion and where Labour comes in, because where Labour comes in is with the view that Spinoza gets this right at the fundamental level, but he lacks dynamism, he lacks development. Labour is creative. So we have to develop from Spinoza's notion of substance to Marx's notion of labour. That retains the solution to Descartes' problem. We don't have a dualism, but it overcomes Spinoza's problem, which is completely lacking in that dialectical development, that creativity. You can see that you're retaining Spinoza because labour doesn't break the laws of nature. It uses the laws of nature creatively to create new things. It can't break them, they are fixed. So I think that speaks to the other comment around, isn't there a terrible problem with the static nature of norms and so on? Well, there isn't. If you take what Ilyenkov's saying, he can get the Spinozist solution, that's static, then he can use German idealism, Hegel, but on a Spinozist basis to get dynamism and dialectical development. And actually, the critique of Hegel, according to Ilyenkov, is despite his greatness, etc., he can't quite achieve the Spinozist solution. So he's ultimately Cartesian, according to Ilyenkov, Hegel. I mean, Hegel's fantastic, and Ilyenkov loves him, but in very careful language, Ilyenkov's forced to say that there is a problem, and it's a problem of dualism in Hegel, because he doesn't have that Spinozist foundation. He gives you the dynamism, but he doesn't have that materialist solution to the problem of thought and being.
So I think it's a very fair point, and in a sense, I think it's a fair point insofar as even within Hegelian circles, there are everlasting debates about, for example, was Hegel a naturalist? So Hegel's naturalism, and what kind of naturalist was Hegel? And then you had back in the days, you had right Hegelians, and the right Hegelian were much more like nature and spirit, and spirit is nature is a slumbering spirit. So you do have this dualism. It also depends what kind of reading of Hegel you have in that respect. So in that particular respect, it can be a fair point. So you can have, and also in my own, I have a pretty naturalist continuous reading of Hegel. Then of course that's also why I tend to gravitate towards the Marxian counterpart. But I think it's fair. It can be argued that Hegel is still, I mean, I would say Cartesian, but it's still, there's a form of dualism between nature and spirit. On the other hand, I will also push back a little bit on this because, well, first of all, there seems to be a thing between leftists and Spinoza. There's because it keeps coming back. I was Tony Negri also has several books on Spinoza. There's I think it's the appeal of Spinoza is the idea of trying to break. It's like this post-operaism tradition is breaking up with the classic Hegelo-Marxism, Leninism, and rethinking about this idea of cognitive capitalism, immaterial labor, and then the response to that, they were using Spinoza about this idea of multitude. So essentially all this autonomist version of the Marxist tradition really likes Spinoza because he breaks with the more institutionalized Hegelo Marxism, the Hegelo-Marxism of the Soviet kind. But to this was more of a joking comment. But I think my question to you would be, how the heck do you get from Spinoza to Marx without going through Hegel? Because that's exactly what Hegel, in the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit, that is probably the most famous quote in all of Hegel's. No, maybe the second famous quote. The most famous quote is the one of the rational and the real and the rational. But probably the second most famous quote is that in the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit, when Hegel says that the whole point of philosophy is to understand the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject. And subject is, again, not the subject of Kant and Fichte, the individual transcendental subject is the collective subject. And essentially what this quote is saying is that you need to take Spinoza's substance and give it dynamism, which is exactly what you were talking about. Spinoza likes the dynamism. So in order so if you want what I think you want, and I think I want too, you need to go through Hegel. You need, and then you need to choose what kind of reading of Hegel you want to have. You don't want to have the right Hegelian spiritualist dualist reading. You want to have a more naturalist leaning reading, but you don't get that dynamism and you don't get that continuity between niche construction and socialist construction, between behavior and labor, without that dynamism.
I know that we've got no time, but just to say, what you've just perfectly demonstrated is that Ilyenkov's reading of Spinoza, Hegel and Marx is different from Negri's. A lot of the classical Western readings of Spinoza use Spinoza against Hegel. Ilyenkov does not. Ilyenkov's used Spinoza to bring out a missing element in Hegel, the fact that Hegel's ultimately idealistic, because there's an issue about thought and being that Spinoza gets right and Hegel doesn't quite. But Ilyenkov, given that basis, then says Hegel's the greatest genius ever, and says we need to. That's how we turn Hegel right side up. We don't get rid of him like Negri wants. We use him, but we use him through the materialist lenses of Spinoza.
Very interesting. It's all these dialectics of Eastern and Western Marxism is something new, relatively new to me, but it did get my attention. That's very interesting.
Well, to tie back a few lines of criticism, and then, yeah, maybe we can, after that, take one more question from Natalia, then conclude, if that's all right. Are you okay time-wise, Andrea? Yeah, okay, great. So we'll come in a second to Natalia.
Sorry.
Well, okay, that's fine. I can make my comment afterwards. We'll go straight to Natalia then.
No, just quickly, a very fast remark about Spinoza in the Soviet tradition, because I was just doing something with it, and I would like, I say Majdansky maybe could also answer better. Spinoza was dynamized in this 1920s. It was a big renaissance of Spinoza, and Ilyenkov is connecting to Spinoza through the tradition of the Soviet avant-garde, beginning from Plekhanov and going through the whole 1920s. And Spinoza was dynamized not necessarily through Hegel, but through thermodynamics and system theories. For example, Bogdanov, as a reader for Spinoza, is not Hegelian, yes? It is just some kind of modernization and dynamization of substance through law of thermodynamics and translation it into new laws of physics, materialist science of this way. So it is a big tradition to think Spinoza without Hegel in Soviet time. Yes, just
interesting. Thank you. Okay.
This is. Can I add something on that?
Yeah,
because,
sure.
I mean, of course, thermodynamics. This is also, I would say, a very inactive move. I mean, it may be done independently, but thermodynamics plays a central role in the newest version. The autopoiesis theory less. It's all about this circularity, self-maintenance. But more recently, this idea that self-maintenance doesn't. It's about thermodynamics. It's about autonomous systems are fundamentally far from equilibrium systems, and far from equilibrium systems need energy and matter from the environment to keep going. And this is to connect to Lars' comment from a few minutes ago. This paper by Weber and Varela in 2002, they rely very heavily on Jonas, and Jonas has this concept of needful freedom. Autonomous systems are fundamentally free, but in their freedom is articulated in the fact that they need they need a continual relation to the environment because they're essentially far from equilibrium, and they're trying to cash it out in a way that is very much not Hegelian. So they're criticizing Kant's idea of teleology, and they're using Jonas, they're using all this stuff, but they're saying, no, this is not Hegelian. And we actually wrote a paper to say, well, it's more Hegelian than you think. but that's another story.
But it was also didn't stay in contradiction. It's Hegelian point of view and a point of view of Spinoza thermodynamics and, for example, Engels. Yes, it is not necessarily Marx, but Engels with dialectic of nature, which is based very much on thermodynamics and electricity theories of the 19th century. And it is this line of dynamization through the substance in some kind of mechanistic way on the one side, and on the other side, Hegel was also considered as a follower from Spinoza. He was like inscribed in this tradition, and the spirit and subject is a kind of grandchild of Spinoza's substance in this Soviet optics. Yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you. That's interesting context to bring. Okay, so I guess I wanted to, in part, bring it back to some of the lines of criticism that I think remain maybe as challenges here. In partly because of, I guess one way I'd approach it is, again, as a kind of defense of Ilyenkov against the criticism in the paper. Maxim brought out a point about the focus on sustaining ourselves, and within enactivism and much earlier, you have the idea of autopoiesis. Even if we go back to its classical roots, is different to praxis. So in enactivism, you've got the idea of normativity is related to viability. Now, viability is kind of bare life. It's my ability to sustain my own life, to not die. Now, there's a lot about recognizing our collective wealth, the wealth of nature. It's not just about sustaining myself and not merging with my environment, but it's about a kind of creative building. So when Ilyenkov is talking about this being a precondition, it's kind of this viability. Obviously, we have to be viable as organisms, but then personality, which is to do with us socially recognizing each other, is to do with our projects. And through these kind of projects, these kind of collective ways to imagine how things could be different. It's not just about, okay, there's a norm now, we can modify this norm. Now let's modify this other norm. It's how, I guess as the provocation, normativity isn't just how we prevent collapse into nothingness. It's how the ideal reveals new possible paths through our social relations that aren't prefigured in the paths that have already been trodden.
So it's a very nice question. I think there's a ton that could be said about this. So the first thing, I actually like very much this framing. So you have autopoiesis, you have poiesis and praxis. It's a very old Aristotelian distinction. And then like the more modern cashing out, so you have a viability and personality. So you cannot reduce one to the other, and we're criticizing Ilyenkov for doing so. So this might be a little bit of a nuanced point that we're trying to do, and maybe it was also a little bit of a rhetorical move, but I think there's something to it in the sense that in a very another absolutely central paper in the enactive approach, which is the 2005 paper by Ezequiel Di Paolo on, it's a 4-concept title, autopoiesis, adaptivity agency, autopoiesis, teleology, adaptivity agency. And essentially the key idea in that paper is autopoiesis is all about robustness. Again, we come back to Maxim's question once again, this robustness versus variation, more or less. And Ezequiel is saying there is saying, well, if you need to account for agency, self-maintenance is not enough, because you have robustness, but you don't have agency. What you need is to introduce the concept of adaptivity within the framework, and so the adaptivity is the ability of the system to regulate its relation to the environment in a more nuanced way, which is not just it's not just about self-maintenance, it's about degrees of self-maintenance. It's about how I approach the limit of my viability, so I move back. And I think this idea is very much implemented in this idea of this scaffolded landscape of autonomy. So of course, personality is not reducible to metabolism. My behavioral habits are not reducible to metabolism, but there is a strong connection, which is not necessarily what Ilienko was criticizing, and what Leontine is criticizing is essentially social Darwinism. Is this idea that personality is in your genes. So you have the genetic program that tells you how you behave. So essentially, as I was saying, the point is fair and well taken, but this also risks cutting out the embodied foundation of sociality. So in a way, I agree with you, but I'm also pushing back a little bit in the sense that there is a risk there of having that is there also in Engels, it's there also in Lukács, of having like this sharp distinction of nature and society that I'm not sure we want to have.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for your time. I'll pass back to Corinna for us to